May 21, 1809. Vienna lay behind Napoleon. The Danube was now at his back. By early afternoon, roughly 25,000 French troops had reached the north bank. Their bridgehead rested on two villages, Aspern on the left and Essling on the right. Behind the line stood Lobo Island, linked to the southern bank by temporary bridges. Every reinforcement, gun and wagon still coming forward, had to use that route. Napoleon expected Archduke Charles to keep retreating. The Austrian army had already fallen back through Bavaria, and then abandoned Vienna, so the emperor assumed he would meet, at worst, a strong rear guard while the rest of the French army crossed. The reports arriving from the front told a different story. Charles was not withdrawing. His main army was coming forward in 5 attack columns, tens of thousands of troops moving toward a French position that had only part of its infantry and artillery in place. There was another problem. The bridges could be broken. The Danube was high, and floating obstacles carried downstream could interrupt the only line connecting Napoleon with the men, ammunition and guns still south of the river. A few days earlier, the French had occupied the Habsburg capital. Now Napoleon was standing on the Marchfeld with only part of his army available, and a major river behind him. How had a pursuit turned into this? The answer begins 6 weeks earlier, when Austria decided to go to war again. Austria had suffered one of the best-known defeats of the Napoleonic Wars at Austerlitz. The defeat forced it out of the Third Coalition and confirmed the military position France had established across much of continental Europe. By 1809, however, Vienna saw an opening. Napoleon's war in Spain and Portugal was consuming troops, experienced officers and political attention. Britain remained willing to subsidize another continental coalition, and Austrian leaders believed France might be stretched enough to make another attempt worthwhile. The central military figure was Archduke Charles, Duke of Teschen, and younger brother of Emperor Francis. Charles had spent years fighting French armies and was closely involved in the attempts to improve Austria's forces after the earlier defeats. Organization was revised, infantry methods were simplified, reserves were enlarged, and the monarchy tried to draw more manpower through the Landwehr. The reforms did not create an Austrian version of the Grande Arme. E-training still varied from unit to unit, the command system retained serious weaknesses, and Charles himself doubted whether the empire was fully prepared for another war. Even so, Napoleon would not be facing exactly the army he had defeated in 1805. On the 10th of April, Austrian troops crossed into Bavaria. The test had begun. The opening Austrian advance caught the French and their German allies badly spread out. Marshal Berthier, superb as Napoleon's chief of staff when the emperor was present, struggled to coordinate the army on his own. Davout's Third Corps was particularly exposed near Regensburg. Once Napoleon reached the theatre and took command, the campaign changed pace. Fighting at Tugenhausen, Abensberg, Landshut and Echem restored the French initiative. Charles failed to trap Davout, while Napoleon drove between parts of the Austrian army and then turned back toward the main force. Jean Lannes was one of the commanders repeatedly used in these hard, fast-moving operations. Marshal of the Empire and Duke of Montebello, he had risen from modest origins to become one of Napoleon's most trusted battlefield officers. His reputation for personal courage was such that he was sometimes called the Roland of the army, after the warrior of medieval French legend. His body already carried the record of a career spent close to the fighting. Few of Napoleon's marshals had been wounded as often. At Regensburg, Lannes again showed why that reputation had followed him. When French attacks against the defenses stalled, he threatened to join the next assault himself. The attack went in, the city fell, and the French secured the bridge over the Danube. But the result Napoleon wanted most had escaped him. Charles's main army was still intact. The Austrians crossed the Danube in good order and preserved the force that Napoleon would eventually have to fight. The French marched on Vienna. On the map, the campaign still looked like another rapid success. The decisive battle had simply moved farther east. Vienna surrendered on May 13 after a short bombardment. Politically, the capture was dramatic. Militarily, it settled less than it appeared to. Charles had not sacrificed his main army in the defense of the capital, and his troops remained north of the Danube, with enough strength to continue the campaign. Napoleon now faced a straightforward strategic requirement and a much harder engineering problem. To bring Charles to battle, he had to move a large army across one of Europe's major rivers, while the enemy remained somewhere beyond the far bank. French engineers chose Lobau, a large island east of Vienna, as the staging point. Troops could cross from the southern bank to the island, then pass over narrower channels to the northern shore near Aspern and Essling. It was workable, but the route was long and fragile. The Danube was running high, and the crossings depended on boats and temporary structures rather than permanent bridges. Damage at one section could stop movement along the whole line until engineers reopened it. Each battalion sent north gave Napoleon more strength on the Marchfeld. Each one also became dependent on the same crossing for ammunition, artillery, food and support. Charles did not have to fight every French soldier at once. The opportunity lay in attacking while a large French force was already north of the river, but the rest of the army was still trying to reach it. During the night of May 20 and through the following morning, French units moved across Lobau. Aspern and Essling were occupied to secure the flanks of the bridgehead. By noon on May 21, Napoleon had a substantial force on the north bank, but nowhere close to his whole army. Then the Austrian columns came into view. The Austrian advance developed slowly enough for the French to recognize what was coming, but not slowly enough for Napoleon to solve the weakness behind him. Charles had divided the attack into 5 major columns. The first 3 pressed toward Aspern and the French left. Other formations moved against the center and toward Essling on the right. Serious fighting around Aspern began in mid-afternoon. Marshal Masséna's troops held the village. Its value came from its position, not its size. Aspern covered the left edge of the French bridgehead. If Austrian troops drove through it and turned south, they could threaten the route back toward Lobau. The fighting quickly moved into the approaches, streets and buildings. Austrian units pushed forward, French battalions counterattacked, and control shifted more than once as additional Austrian formations arrived. What had begun as one flank of the battle drew in increasing numbers of men. Napoleon tried to disrupt the Austrian deployment with cavalry. Here, the Austrian use of battalion masses became important. When horsemen threatened, infantry could close into dense formations that gave the cavalry a front of men and bayonets, rather than loose ranks to exploit. The formation gave up some firepower, but it was simpler for less experienced troops to form than a more elaborate square. French cavalry could create confusion and force units to halt or close up. It could not simply ride through infantry that remained steady in mass. While Aspern consumed more troops, the battle spread east toward Essling. Lannes took charge of the French defense there. The village, together with its large granary, supported the right side of Napoleon's position. Austrian attacks were beaten back, and French cavalry tried to exploit the respite. During the fighting, General Aspern, an experienced heavy cavalry commander, was hit by grapeshot and mortally wounded. Later in the evening, another Austrian column reached the area and renewed the pressure. Lannes kept Essling in French hands. Night brought no clear decision. Aspern had been fought over at close range, Essling still held, and Napoleon had passed through the most dangerous hours of the first day without being driven back onto the riverbank. During the darkness, more French troops crossed. By morning, the force north of the Danube would be far stronger than the one that had received Charles's first attack. Napoleon had spent May 21 trying to hold the bridgehead. On May 22, he intended to use it. For Lannes, The night between the 2 days of battle came in a career already marked by wounds that had looked fatal and had not been. 10 years earlier, during the siege of St. Jean d'Acre, he had taken part in another assault and been shot in the head or neck area, leaving him badly wounded close to the fighting. Later accounts credit a grenadier officer with going back for him and bringing the unconscious general to safety. Lannes recovered. Later biographical accounts say he remembered the officer who had saved him and eventually helped provide him with a livelihood through an inn. The story fits what is otherwise clear from his service record. Acre was neither his first serious wound nor his last. Again and again, he returned to command. That history is worth remembering because of another story attached to the campaign of 1809. A later account records that before crossing the Danube, Lannes spoke to Dr. Lanefranc about a sense of foreboding. He reportedly said that, "Whatever happened, this might be his last battle." The exact wording survives through later recollection, not a verbatim battlefield record, so it should be treated with that caution. By dawn on May 22, there was no room for such thoughts in the orders being issued. Napoleon was preparing the main French attack, and Lannes was about to be sent into the center of it. Fresh troops had crossed during the night. By morning, Napoleon had roughly 70,000 men north of the Danube and close to 150 guns. Compared with the previous afternoon, he now had enough strength to attempt something more ambitious than holding the villages. The left still had to be secured first. Fighting resumed around Aspern before dawn, and Massena's troops counterattacked by about 7 in the morning. The village was again in French hands. On the other flank, renewed Austrian attacks around Essling were checked. With both ends of the position temporarily secure, Napoleon sent the center forward. Lannes's Second Corps advanced across the open ground between the villages against the Austrian center. French infantry moved under heavy artillery fire, supported by cavalry and guns. The attack made progress. For a time, the Austrian center was under enough pressure that Charles had to reinforce it rather than wait for the French effort to spend itself. The French command paid for every yard. General Saint-Hilaire, already distinguished in earlier campaigns, suffered a severe leg wound that later proved fatal. Around him, formations lost officers and men, while Austrian artillery continued to strike the advancing lines and columns. Charles's part in the battle became most important here. He did not need a spectacular counterattack. He needed the center to stay together. Grenadier reserves were committed, battered units received support, and Charles remained close enough to the threatened sector to influence the response. The Austrian line bent under the French attack, but did not come apart. Napoleon could still feed more force into the battle, provided Lobau remained connected to the north bank. Then the crossing failed again. The swollen Danube had already carried obstacles and vessels into the French bridge system. Now, while the central attack was consuming ammunition and needed fresh troops and artillery support, traffic across the river was interrupted once more. The consequence reached beyond a delay of several hours. Napoleon had begun the morning assuming that the army on the Marchfeld would continue to grow. Instead, the men already north of the river had to finish the battle with what was immediately available. The French advance lost momentum and stopped. Charles's center remained in place, and Austrian pressure returned to the flanks. Aspern was lost again. At Essling, Austrian troops briefly forced their way into the village before French counterattacks, including units of the Young Guard, recovered part of the position. By early afternoon, Napoleon was dealing with a different battle from the one he had planned. At dawn, breaking Charles's center was no longer the immediate problem. The bridges had made the security of his own army the priority. The offensive was finished. Napoleon began arranging the withdrawal toward Lobau. That order did not send the army running for the river. Large numbers of French troops were still fighting around the villages, and units had to disengage in sequence, while engineers worked to keep the route behind them usable. Cavalry helped hold Austrian formations at a distance. Infantry continued to contest Essling long enough for other troops to move south. Charles had the field, but his own army had been through 2 days of close combat. Losses were heavy, ammunition was running low in parts of the line, and many formations were disordered. The Austrians therefore did not turn the French withdrawal into the destruction of Napoleon's army. The distinction was practical rather than rhetorical. Napoleon had been forced off the north bank, yet the Grande Army was still concentrated around Lobau and remained capable of continuing the campaign. For Lannes, the retreat would end very differently. Lannes was still on the field while the withdrawal was being organized. The main French attack had already failed, and units were beginning to move back. The most intense part of his day's work appeared to be over. A cannonball then struck him in the legs. The injury was catastrophic. One leg was shattered so badly that the surgeons would have no choice but to amputate it. Lannes was placed on a stretcher and carried away from the fighting. The scene echoed Acre without needing to be made into a legend. 10 years earlier, a grave wound had left him helpless near a battle line, and another soldier had brought him back. At Essling, he was again being carried from the field. Napoleon learned who the wounded officer was and went to him. Accounts describe the emperor hurrying to Lannes as the stretcher was brought away from the fighting, rather than waiting for a formal report in the rear. Sources differ over the exact words exchanged, and there is no reason to manufacture a perfect conversation. The recorded action is enough. In the middle of an army withdrawing toward Lobau, Napoleon went to see his wounded friend. The two men had known each other since the revolutionary campaigns in Italy. Long before Lannes became a duke and Napoleon an emperor, their relationship had included arguments and unusually blunt exchanges, as well as years of campaigning together. Lannes's loss therefore carried two meanings for Napoleon. An experienced battlefield commander was gone from the line, and an old companion was lying badly wounded. Surgeons amputated the shattered limb. For several days there was still reason to hope. Lannes had survived grave wounds before, and on May 24 Napoleon wrote that the Duke of Montebello had lost a leg, but was out of danger. He was wrong. On May 31, 9 days after Essling, Jean Lannes died at the age of 40. For Napoleon, the loss went far beyond replacing the commander of the Second Corps. Lannes had fought beside him since the Italian campaigns, long before Bonaparte became emperor. Writing to Lannes's widow, Napoleon remembered him as his companion in arms of 16 years, and as his best friend. The Grande Armée had lost one of its most experienced commanders. The man who had survived Acre and returned after repeated wounds would not return from Essling. Napoleon had saved his army from destruction, but he had not brought the same army back to Lobau. Thousands were dead or wounded, the advance across the Danube had failed, and one of the commanders he trusted most was gone. Charles had forced Napoleon to abandon the field, but he had not destroyed the Grande Armée. On Lobau, the French fortified the island, rebuilt the bridge system on a stronger scale, and gathered reinforcements. The weakness exposed in May was clear. Troops had reached the north bank faster than the bridges could reliably support them. 6 weeks later, the French crossed the Danube again. Charles was waiting. The battlefield was Wagram.